I never thought I'd find myself spending every evening at an auto shop, but here I was again, walking through the bay doors just as the sun started to dip below the horizon. The smell of motor oil and metal had become weirdly comforting over the past 2 weeks. My ancient Honda Civic sat up on the lift, looking like a patient in surgery, and underneath it was Marcus, the mechanic who'd somehow turned what should have been a simple brake job into something I couldn't stop thinking about. It started 3 weeks ago when my brakes started making that grinding sound that means you've ignored a problem way too long. I'd been putting off the repair because, honestly, money was tight and I was terrified of what some mechanic might tell me was wrong. But when the grinding turned into a metal-on-metal screech that made pedestrians turn and stare, I knew I couldn't avoid it anymore. I picked Marcus's shop basically at random, just a small independent garage tucked between a laundromat and a Vietnamese restaurant in a part of town I rarely visited. Marcus was under a truck when I first walked in, and all I could see were his legs in oil-stained work pants and a pair of boots that had seen better days. When he rolled out on the creeper to greet me, I felt something shift in my chest that I wasn't prepared for. He had these warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, dark hair that fell across his forehead, and grease smudged on his cheekbone that he didn't seem to notice. He was maybe a few years older than me, early 30s to my late 20s, with forearms that flexed as he stood up and wiped his hands on a rag that only made them dirtier. "What can I do for you?" he asked, and his voice had this quiet confidence that immediately put me at ease. I explained about the brakes, expecting the usual mechanic routine of sucked teeth and ominous predictions about expensive repairs. Instead, Marcus just nodded and said he'd take a look, no pressure, no judgment about how long I'd let it go. When he quoted me a price that was actually reasonable, I almost hugged him out of sheer relief. "I can get the parts by tomorrow," he said. "Have it done by end of day if you want to leave it." I told him that would be perfect. And that's when he did something that surprised me. He asked if I wanted to stick around while he did the initial assessment, said some people like to understand what was actually wrong with their car. Most mechanics I'd dealt with treated customers like annoyances who got in the way of the real work. Marcus seemed genuinely interested in explaining things. So I stayed, and I watched him jack up my car with this careful precision, his movements efficient, but never rushed. He started pointing out the worn brake pads, the scored rotors, explaining everything in terms I could actually understand. And then he asked me to hand him a wrench from his tool chest. It was such a simple request, but the way he said it, "Hey, could you grab me that 3/4-inch socket?" made me feel useful instead of in the way. I found the socket, or at least what I thought was the right one, and handed it to him. Our fingers touched as he took it from me, just the briefest contact, but his hand lingered for a second longer than necessary. He looked up at me from where he was kneeling by the wheel, and something passed between us that I couldn't quite name. "Thanks," he said softly, and I felt heat creep up my neck. That night I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. I told myself I was being ridiculous, reading into something completely innocent. He was just being friendly. Just being a decent mechanic who didn't treat his customers like walking wallets. But my mind kept replaying the way his fingers had brushed mine, the way his eyes had held my gaze for just a beat too long. The next evening, I came back to pick up my car. I didn't need to be there for the work, but Marcus had mentioned he'd be doing it after hours since he was backed up with other jobs, and I'd offered to keep him company. I told myself it was because I was genuinely interested in learning more about car repair. I'd been living on my own for 5 years and still barely knew how to check my oil. This was practical, educational. That's what I kept telling myself as I walked back into that garage. Marcus was already under my car when I arrived, and I called out to let him know I was there. He rolled out with that same easy smile, a new smudge of grease on his jaw. "Right on time," he said. "I'm just getting started. You really want to watch me bleed brake lines for the next couple hours?" I told him I had nothing better to do, which was a lie. I had a stack of work emails I should have been answering and a Netflix queue that wasn't going to watch itself. But somehow, spending my evening in a garage with this man I barely knew felt more important than any of that. He got back to work, and I pulled up an old stool to sit on. For a while, I just watched, fascinated by the way he moved, the casual competence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times but still treated each task with care. Then, he started asking for tools again. "Can you hand me that ratchet?" The one with the red handle. I found it and brought it over, and again that brush of fingers as he took it. This time, I was certain it wasn't accidental. His thumb traced across my knuckles for just a fraction of a second, and when I looked at his face, I saw a faint smile playing at his lips. My heart was hammering as I went back to my stool. I tried to act normal, tried to focus on what he was explaining about the brake system, but all I could think about was that touch. I'd dated women throughout college in my early 20s, had a couple of serious relationships that ended amicably enough, but I'd always felt like something was missing. There were moments, fleeting thoughts about certain guys that I'd always pushed away, labeled as admiration or just appreciating someone's appearance the way you might appreciate a painting. But sitting in that garage, watching Marcus work, feeling this pull toward him that was unmistakably attraction, I couldn't push it away anymore. He asked for another tool, a torque wrench this time, and I had to ask him to point it out because I had no idea what I was looking for. He stood up and walked over to the tool chest with me, standing close enough that I could smell motor oil and something else. Maybe his deodorant, or just him. He reached past me to grab the wrench, and his arm brushed against my shoulder. "This one," he said quietly, and he was so close I could feel his breath on my neck. Every nerve in my body was suddenly awake and singing. "You okay?" he asked, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he handed me the wrench with that same deliberate brush of fingers. This time, he didn't look away. His eyes searched mine like he was asking a question, waiting to see how I'd answer. I don't know what he saw in my face, but something shifted in his expression, a kind of quiet recognition. We fell into a rhythm after that. He'd work for a bit, then ask for a tool, and I'd bring it to him. Each exchange became this tiny moment of connection, fingers lingering, eyes meeting, neither of us acknowledging what was happening, but both of us fully aware. He started asking me about myself between tasks, where I worked, what I did for fun, normal getting-to-know-you questions, but they felt weighted with something more. I told him about my job in marketing, how I'd moved to the city after college and was still figuring out what I wanted from life. He told me about how he'd opened the shop 5 years ago after working for someone else who didn't appreciate his work, how he loved the problem-solving aspect of repair, the satisfaction of fixing something that was broken. "That's kind of beautiful," I said without thinking, and he laughed, a warm sound that filled the garage. "Most people think it's just dirty work," he said. "But yeah, I guess it is kind of beautiful when you put it that way." The way he looked at me when he said it made my stomach flip. It was getting late, past 9, and he was finally finishing up. "Want to help me test them?" he asked, gesturing to my car. "We need to pump the brakes, make sure everything's working right." I nodded and climbed into the driver's seat while he leaned in through the passenger window. "Okay, press the brake pedal a few times," he instructed. I did, and he watched the brake lines, checking for leaks. "Good, now hold it down." I pressed the pedal and held it, and he leaned further into the car, his face close to mine as he looked at the dashboard indicators. We were inches apart, and I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint stubble on his jaw. "Feels good," he said softly, and I wasn't entirely sure he was talking about the brakes anymore. Neither of us moved for a long moment, the air between us charged with possibility. Then his phone rang, shattering the moment, and he pulled back with what looked like regret. He answered it, some supplier calling about parts, and I took the opportunity to breathe and try to calm my racing heart. When he hung up, he seemed to make a decision about something. "Hey," he said, "I know this is probably weird, but would you want to grab a beer or something? There's a place down the street that stays open late." My mouth went dry. This was it, the moment where I had to decide how to respond, whether to acknowledge what was clearly happening between us or pretend it was just a friendly offer. "I'd like that," I heard myself say, and the smile that broke across his face made me feel like I'd just won something precious. We walked to the bar together, and it felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. Marcus washed up quickly in the shop's bathroom, but still had traces of grease under his fingernails, and I found it endearing rather than off-putting. The bar was a low-key place with dim lighting and a decent beer selection, exactly the kind of spot you'd go when you wanted to actually talk to someone. We grabbed a booth in the back, and once we sat down, the nervous energy I'd been feeling all evening crystallized into something sharper, more immediate. We talked for hours. The conversation flowed easily, moving from surface topics to deeper things. He told me about growing up in the Midwest, how he'd always been good with his hands, how his family hadn't understood his choice to be a mechanic instead of going to college. I told him about my own family, my parents who loved me but had very specific ideas about what my life should look like, ideas that included a wife and kids and a career path I wasn't sure I wanted. "Do you ever feel like you're living the life people expect rather than the one you want?" I asked, and he nodded slowly. "Every day," he said, "until I opened the shop. That was the first time I did something just for me, Stopped trying to fit into someone else's vision." He paused, took a sip of his beer, and then said, "Can I ask you something personal?" My heart started racing again. "Sure," I managed. "Earlier in the shop, was I reading that wrong? Because if I was, I apologize. I just thought—" He trailed off, suddenly looking vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. I could have deflected, could have played it safe and pretended I didn't know what he meant. Instead, I found myself saying, "You weren't reading it wrong." The relief that washed over his face was palpable. "Okay," he said. "Good, that's good. Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since you first walked into my shop, and I was pretty sure I was going crazy." We talked until the bar started closing down around us, the bartender giving us pointed looks as he wiped down tables. Marcus paid for our beers despite my protests, and we walked back to the shop where my car was waiting. The night air was cool, and our arms brushed as we walked, neither of us pulling away. When we reached my car, I didn't want the evening to end. "So," I said awkwardly, "I guess my car's fixed now. No reason to come back." Marcus grinned. "Well, you should probably get your oil changed in a few months, and I could teach you how to do some basic maintenance yourself if you want. Might take a few sessions." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. "I'd like that." He stepped closer, and my breath caught. "I'm going to kiss you now," he said quietly, "if that's okay." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and then his lips were on mine, gentle and questioning at first, then deeper as I responded. It felt like something inside me that had been locked up tight suddenly opened, and I kissed him back with a kind of desperate relief, like I'd been waiting my whole life for this moment without knowing it. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing hard. "Wow," he said, and I couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah," I agreed. "Wow." We stood there for a while longer, neither of us wanting to leave until finally I knew I had to go. "I'll see you soon?" I asked, and he nodded. "Definitely. I'll text you about that maintenance lesson." He already had my number from the work order, and the thought of him reaching out, of this not being a one-time thing, made me ridiculously happy. I drove home with a grin I couldn't wipe off my face, my car running smoothly with its new brakes, my mind replaying every moment of the evening. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was stepping into my own truth, scary and exhilarating and right. And it had all started with a simple request to hand someone a tool, with fingers brushing and eyes meeting, and the courage to acknowledge what was happening between us. Sometimes the most ordinary moments become the hinges on which our lives turn, and I was grateful that I'd been brave enough to walk through that door when it opened.